Okay, now we're going to look at some other aspects of Roman civilization, including law, economics, and the Roman social structure. The thing I want to say about Roman law is they put something down that is established very early on. You see the date 450 BCE, not too long after the Roman Republic began. And this was able to be adapted to the different populations that the Romans ended up conquering at different times. As we already know, they expanded quite a bit and incorporated many different diverse peoples under them. So you needed a flexible amount of law, a way of doing the law to make it work. The 12 Tables was the establishment of that. And we see, just for example, a couple of things, from the Romans that we see as legacies that our civilization picked up on. The idea of being innocent until proven guilty, a concept that we, of course, adopted, that the Romans started. The idea to challenge your accuser in court, for example. And this would especially be important if you were a plebeian being accused of doing something to a patrician, an upper-class aristocrat. And so this would be, these are just a couple of small examples of how Roman law has a legacy beyond just their time period, but extending into Western civilization and our civilization. Roman economics, we mentioned the latifundia in the last video, the large plantations. Well, they're able to produce so much that they're able to export all the different grain and foodstuffs all across the empire. So, for example, like we talked about with the Greece, where they can't really grow the food they need there, they have to trade. Well, other parts of the empire can grow enough grain, and so that's how you feed that part of the empire. And then the people living in Greece would, of course, make olive oil, and that would be shipped to other parts of the empire. So eventually, as Rome expands, you have this huge economic network within the Mediterranean basin, and Mare Nostrum becomes, which means our sea. The Mediterranean Sea becomes their sea. And so the Roman Empire at its height is an economic juggernaut within its own region. And on top of that, it's connected to the Silk Roads. So you have the different empires in the Middle East connected to India, connected to China, connected to the east coast of Africa, through the Indian Ocean trade network. So even though the Mediterranean basin is kind of isolated from all of that to some degree, they were still connected, and that also helped with Roman wealth. Regarding family and society, we have what we call father of the family, pater familia. And you can see, just like every place else we've studied, the Romans were also extremely patriarchal. And the notion here wasn't much different than what we've seen. There was the right to arrange marriages. You could sell your children into slavery, which was unfortunately all too common among the plebeian class in order to be able to survive. So women could also be sold into slavery. A husband could sell his wife, for example. Women were not allowed to inherit property, and so, you can see that women in this time period aren't much better off than any other place in the world that we've studied. What we have as the Roman Republic turns into the empire, the new rich people who get rich as basically merchants through all the trade that's going on, they challenge the aristocracy, so that creates conflict there. Unfortunately, just because you got people rich off the land and now people rich off of trade growing, the poor class size was also growing as well. So what did the emperors do? Well, the famous saying of bread and circuses. And what they mean by that is the poor people could come to these events that the emperor would put on, not just in Rome, but in all the provinces throughout the empire. And you would feed the people, so they come there and they get free food. usually a big hunk of bread, but also other things. And the circuses represents any kind of entertainment. So, of course, you could go to chariot races. You could, such as at the Circus Maximus, where it could fit 250,000 people. That's a huge number of people into one venue. You think about like our modern day football stadiums that hold, the biggest ones hold about 100 to 110,000, not even half the size of this. So the Roman attractions were big. You had the Colosseum where you had your gladiatorial games, and people came there and were entertained. The Roman Colosseum held about 50,000 people. So a way to keep the masses entertained. The masses were also kept happy because Rome and a lot of its areas were wealthy and it benefited everybody. For example, the underground sewage, the aqueducts, it kept the city clean. Not just Rome, but other cities as well. So their engineering prowess benefited everybody. The imported goods that came from around the world, if you needed something from anywhere in the world, you could get it somewhere in the Roman Empire. So, the people benefited to some degree with all of this stuff. The city of Rome itself was huge, with over 1 million people at this time. Lots of monumental architecture. I mentioned the aqueducts. They built everything with concrete, which gave it a lasting and enduring structures. And of course, they built all this in concrete. Yet when the Roman Empire collapses later in 476. Eventually the recipe for concrete is lost for over 1,000 years. So it shows you some of the remarkable achievements of the Romans. Finally, the last thing to talk about is slavery within the empire. We've seen that all of the places we've looked at so far had slavery. All of them did to some degree, although we saw China didn't need it or emphasize it as much. But slavery was prominent in the Roman Empire, probably more so than anywhere else, except maybe some of the Greek city-states. By the 2nd century CE, it's estimated that 1/3 of the empire was made up of slaves. And, they could be doing any kind of work, agriculture, quarries, working in mines, all kinds of hard chain labor, so to speak. And, of course, slaves were also made up a big chunk of the gladiators who, in a lot of cases, were fighting for their lives. And, of course, the most famous slave revolt came under Spartacus, who was a gladiator himself, who led a group of slaves, and they terrorized the countryside. Not really terrorized the countryside, but managed to go around and get other slaves to join their massive revolt until they were finally put down by the Roman legions. The only positive thing you could say about slavery in the Roman Empire was it was customary to manumit, which means to free your slave at age 30. So at least, you were free at some point, typically, although, of course, we know the average lifespan wasn't that long during this time, so if you made it to 30, you probably didn't have much longer to go.